You're listening to Secure Ventures, a show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plight, glories, and revolutionary products. I'm your host, Kyle McNulty. I'm also a full-time investor at InQtel, a strategic investor for the U.S. intelligence and defense communities. This show is a personal outside activity separate from and not affiliated with InQtel in any manner. All comments, opinions, and sponsorships are wholly independent. With me in this episode is Pete Martin. Pete is CEO and co-founder of Realm Security, which is building a security data fabric to help companies manage their disparate log sources for monitoring tools. For companies spending millions of dollars every year on contracts with Splunk, Realm is the light at the end of the tunnel that can help them move to a more cost-effective SIEM tool. Pete started his career at Rapid7 after dropping out of college, and he worked his way through a variety of cybersecurity sales leadership roles since, including companies acquired by CarbonBlack and Cisco. In the episode, we talk about his emphasis on moving roles for new learning opportunities, his obsession with customer problems rather than potential solutions, and how Realm's message is unique in a cyber ecosystem where vendors are always asking for CISOs to grow their budget. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Pete, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's go back towards the early career for you in cyber, where you were working, I think, as a BDR doing sales in vulnerability management. And I think one of the unique parts about your career and your backstory, as I kind of dug through your LinkedIn, is you left Rapid7. You went to Confer, which was then acquired by CarbonBlack. So an awesome outcome in itself there. And I'm sure you're instrumental in terms of kind of building revenue at Confer, leading to that acquisition. You went back to Rapid7 after that kind of 5-year hiatus. Maybe start by telling me a little bit more about that process, joining Confer, and what the revenue growth looked like. And then I want to tie back to that piece with the Rapid7 return.
Yeah, totally. So by way of introduction, name's Pete Martin. I've been in cybersecurity for about 15 years. It was really by chance that I got into cybersecurity. I did an internship at Rapid7 as a BDR when I was 19. And I ended up really enjoying it. And I found cybersecurity to be such a fast evolving discipline that from a fulfillment of learning perspective, I just had natural curiosity toward it. So I actually ended up dropping out of college. So the highest formal level of education that I've ever completed is high school. I wasn't a very good student to begin with, so that was probably for the best. But I ended up working at Rapid7, and I like to joke it was, like 2 dudes in a garage with a dog. It was probably, I think, like 60, 70 people. And it was a great place to learn about security. And, cybersecurity wasn't a standalone discipline at the time. So vulnerability management was more like an activity than a traditional practice. And so a little bit of it was helping evangelize the concept and more like program development versus just, selling a scanner, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What were some lessons that you learned? I mean, I imagine that translates quite well towards building a startup and Realm in terms of evangelizing a product and trying to make the case for it to earn its own practice as opposed to just kind of being a standalone activity like you just mentioned.
Yeah. I'd say the innovator's dilemma is that you can create something that has inherent value and solves problems, but are those problems that people are actively looking to solve for themselves? And so quite often from like a go-to-market sales perspective, a salesperson or a vendor might focus on what they do and why what they do is different. But that really, it doesn't matter. It really more is about what is the situation and what is the outcome that somebody is trying to achieve. And then it's how can you, communicate what you do relative to the outcome that they're pursuing. So, I think regardless of selling vuln management or endpoint or AppSec or SIEM or SOAR, there are inherent specifics about somebody's situation that is more important to learn prior to talking about what you do or how you do it. So I think for me that wasn't like a point in time lesson. That was more of just kind of a evolution, over a few years.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a theme we'll come back to as we get further in the conversation here. So let's go to the next chapter there, where you kind of cut your teeth on security at Rapid7, and then you decide to head over to Confer, which again, like we mentioned, gets acquired. What does that whole story look like? What was that experience like growing that team?
It was a ton of fun. I'd say, I joined pre-product, pre-revenue, and it was really a year or two, I think, before traditional antivirus was getting disrupted. And there was a bunch of different approaches, right? There was like the Bromium and Invincias where they do, VMs around browsers, and there were just different approaches to solving the endpoint problem. I'd say the first year it was a little slow. I think it was a lot of education to customers on why a different approach is needed. There was a really distinct point in time where we started to get momentum and traction. And it really revolved around the PCI requirements. So PCI DSS 5.3, if I remember right, gave acceptance to a DAT file for the signatures being allowed to run in the cloud versus on the endpoint. And so the second that changed, our business really took off. And, you saw a lot of people come up and become successful, like Cylance and CrowdStrike. And I'd say it was really 2 years of like pedal to the metal. We grew the team from just myself as the first sales rep to we had about 20 salespeople. And that's actually where I met the two other co-founders for Realm. So it was Jeff Kramer founded Confer, and then our other co-founder, Sankit, was an engineering manager.
Wow. Okay, so you have this kind of, let's say, well-timed market influence, I would say, in this scenario that you just described, right? That really led to a lot of the growth here. You have the acquisition, and then you end up rejoining Rapid7, like I alluded to. What was the story there? What was it like rejoining a company that you'd worked with 5 years prior? That just seems like something fairly unique and out of the ordinary.
I mean, it was, it's all relative to like what kind of opportunities or experiences you're looking to have.
Totally.
It was fun. I mean, there was definitely like Rapid7 is a great organization and really good leadership and culture. And I'd say there was a bunch of people that were still there that I got to kind of rejoin forces with. And then there was a lot of new people. When I left Rapid7, it was vuln management and pen testing. And then when I rejoined, they were moving more toward a platform with a SIEM and AppSec and a few different offerings. So I definitely had a lot to learn going back. But yeah, it just ended up being right as far as the type of opportunity I was looking for and what they needed in a hire.
Yeah, fair enough. And I guess if you have a positive experience with the company the first time around and they have the same, I guess, and like leadership that still supports you and is a fan of you, then it's pretty straightforward in that regard. I guess the kind of key piece that you alluded to there is if it's the right thing that you're looking for at that point in your career, which I guess after the acquisition, looking for just a kind of new experience, a new opportunity, that it makes sense to make the transition back there.
Yeah. So for me, from a go-to-market perspective, I traditionally had ran like inside sales. And so people who work with smaller organizations on relatively smaller, simpler transactions. So I went to Rapid7 to run the West Coast field sales team. So it was, for me, it was something that I hadn't had a chance to do. And it was a great opportunity to learn. And great experience.
Yeah. So let's talk about the next piece then as we get closer and closer to Realm, where you then leave Rapid7. I think this is like 2022, 2023, and join Ort, which got acquired by Cisco. So then the second successful acquisition that you were a part of as a revenue leader, which is awesome. I mean, tell me a little bit more about that experience, maybe starting with, you've kind of alluded to it throughout this conversation, the emphasis on going to a new place in order to learn something new. So that transition from inside sales to field sales. What was the transition to Ort inspired by?
So that situation, the company needed somebody to run everything customer facing. So for me, I love sales. Sales will always be a component of my life in multiple ways, shapes, and forms. But I've always wanted to, have more influence and learn more and get exposed and uncomfortable in ways that I hadn't prior. So, running sales engineering and customer success and being more integrated with engineering and product and helping determine what type of solution, we should bring to market and how should we bring it to market. And so, I joined Ort, and it was early. It wasn't pre-product, pre-revenue. They had a little bit of a footprint, but it was, how do you come in and create a repeatable process from a go-to-market perspective, and then also from a customer success and ultimate deployment and creating raving fans and things like that.
Sure. Okay, so now let's tie this all together with Realm, where there's kind of a natural moving on point from Ort, where you have the acquisition, again, in just about a year. So awesome timing for you there. Yeah. And then we've already talked about the tailwinds that you benefited from with Confer in terms of market dynamics. So tell me a little bit more about what the process was like in terms of getting going with Realm and how you and the team decided that this was the right technology area to go ahead and pursue.
Yeah. So, Cisco acquired Ort, and then, I, for good or bad or indifferent, I really love the early stages. I love the concept of taking something that's an idea and turning it into a company. And so, Jeff, one of my founders, and then Sanket, the other founder, we all had kept in touch and kind of had intentions of working together again. And so we started talking in January, and we initially were thinking of going to market with a little bit of a different solution, more of the tier one SOC automation, helping people deal with alert fatigue. And we talked to 50, 60 CISOs and security practitioners, and we kept hearing a more basic problem, which was, an explosion of data. And not just from the perspective of a security analyst needing to review the data, but more from an operational challenge of managing the data. Both, how do I consume it, whether it be, it lives on-prem and I need to get it to the cloud, or it's streamed via an API and I need to ingest it in a different format than it's being communicated in. So what we ended up finding was CISOs estimate that their log volume has grown between 300 to 400% in the last 24 months. And so, we kept hearing that same thing. And so we kind of, we also had a fundamental belief that the SOC automation and helping, manage alerts was a little bit of a feature and a subset of what a SIEM does and what a SOAR does. And don't get me wrong, you could build a successful company doing one thing and doing it really well. But for us, we felt like we could build a bigger company and more of a, multi-service, multi-product platform if we start really close to the creation of signals and just solve a really simple problem there.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation earlier today where someone said that there are 38 autonomous SOC agent companies in 2024. So there's certainly a whole bunch of other folks that have decided to tackle that market, and certainly a lot of relevance for AI, but I think probably to your benefit, other problems that are also very important with maybe less folks going after them as well. So one of the things I'm particularly curious about, and I'm always interested in when people mention it on this show, is the interviews and kind of customer discovery interviews that folks have before they really commit to an idea. You just mentioned that you had 50 to 60 conversations with CISOs. I mean, this seems like one of the things I've heard time and time again that help really successful companies, because they're building some of those early champions. They're understanding and kind of validating that their idea is actually wanted by the market, as opposed to will be desired in a few years as other market dynamics evolve, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me a little bit more just about how you went about organizing all these different conversations. Obviously, you and your co-founders had some relationships in place already, but what did it look like to actually put that together?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of an art versus a science. There are some repeatable things that you can do just to develop a framework for gathering market feedback. But generally, you want to ask the same questions in the same ways to a large group of people so that you can effectively compare the feedback to find patterns. But I'd say it's like the classic anecdote where, if you ask somebody back in the day, when people were using horses for transportation and Henry Ford was coming up with the initial car, it's like, how could I improve your life? They'd say, oh, I want a faster horse. People wouldn't say I want a car because they just didn't know. So I think a lot of times it's less about what you're building and it's more about the solution to the problem they have. And there is, I think, a propensity for people to be supportive of ideas and innovative approaches, versus being hypercritical to the point of helping iterate. And so I think it's a balance because everybody has empathy for the entrepreneurial journey and everybody wants to be helpful and nobody, quite frankly, wants to tell you your baby's ugly. And so it's coming to the conversation with a little bit of a tone of, hey, look, the likelihood of us coming to you in our first idea being the right idea is zero. There's no chance we're going to get this right from the beginning. So while we appreciate positive commentary and support, we're actually more interested in understanding why we're wrong or where we could be better. And so, I think it's a balance of having continuity in the questions you ask, but also making sure the tone of the conversation is look, we want constructive criticism and we want to be told how we could be better versus, tell us everything's going to be great and, we have it all figured out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another thing that occurs to me with these kind of circumstances, when you haven't started a company yet, then you're clearly not trying to sell anything, right? Which I think a lot of CISOs are very resistant to the idea of being sold something because there's so many vendors that are trying to sell CISOs things these days. How did you kind of capitalize on that advantage, or was that a conscious thought where you said, hey, we should have as many conversations as possible before we actually have something baked? Because it's actually going to be easier to talk to CISOs and just say, hey, can you give us feedback on an idea, as opposed to hey, can you give us feedback on this product that we have built and are also trying to sell to people who look just like you?
Well, I think, it's partially a byproduct of how many people are already solving the problem. And I think that sometimes naturally can inform whether or not you yourself should solve the problem, right? If it's already a pretty well understood problem and there's a lot of potential solutions for it, the likelihood of you creating a new company and being able to get meaningful market share and differentiating is lower just because it's already understood. And then I think there's another thing in security, which I felt as a go-to-market person, which is there are so many solutions and products, and I think security decision makers and buyers have started to try and understand what is the path for me to actually get the desired outcome, meaning what is the maintenance of the solution? What do I need to do to configure it to be successful? How does it match up with my own internal infrastructure? And so I think a simpler way to put it is we were talking to a few CISOs and they said, look, I get asked by my board, how much more security can we get for $1 million worth of additional budget? And the answer is not $1 million worth of more security. There's money isn't everything, right? It's kind of basic blocking, tackling, and there's a big part of this which is people. And so there, the technology is one thing, but how do you connect technology, people, and process, and get enough feedback on your idea to understand how to repeatedly bring it to market? So it's a good question. It's a great question. It's a hard dance because you technically don't have anything to sell people. But I think as long as you're trying to solve a problem that is meaningfully persistent in somebody's life, they're usually open to giving you feedback.
I think you bring up something there that's very interesting and particularly unique to what Realm is doing, because you mentioned this idea of how much return on investment do you get for $1 million of budget spent on security. And I think most cyber people have stopped thinking in those terms because it's so hard to quantify return on cyber investment, where you have this kind of small chance, let's say, of like a truly catastrophic event where the downside in that event is so massive that you have like a very small percentage chance combined with a very large downside. And it's really hard to average this out to any sort of like incremental improvement and the likelihood that reduces the likelihood of that catastrophic event, right? And you can make arguments that, okay, these events are actually quite common or like high probability if you're not doing any of these controls. I agree. But the point is, it's difficult to quantify the return on investment. However, Realm is very unique in that a lot of what you're doing is cost reduction, right? Because, and this is a good time to maybe talk a little bit more about your approach and the kind of value proposition. But ultimately, my understanding is by creating this kind of unified security data layer, you're enabling easier switching between SIEM tools, so security incident event management platforms like a Splunk or like a Datadog. And this is a massive cost driver for security teams today, where you have a CISO that's spending millions and millions of dollars each year on like a Splunk contract, for example, but they're locked in because they don't have a way to easily just move over to a new tool. So there actually is a very clear return on investment kind of conversation for Realm that you don't have as much for other security tools. Can you just speak a little bit more to how that has tied into your kind of product vision or the value that you're really trying to go after?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to introduce the company, so Realm Security, we're in the security fabric market, which I realize could probably mean anything. So in short, what we do is we collect all security logs in a central location, and we aid in helping organizations create a needs-based data model, meaning remove the complexity of, what data sources in what format, how they're sent to you, and then what the destination needs from a format perspective, and just make it super drop dead simple to consume all your security logs in one place and then make really easy decisions on what to send where. And so the byproduct of creating that is cost reduction when you think about the volume of logs you're sending to a SIEM or an XDR solution. But also, how do you strategically think about setting up a data lake or an archive, both from a compliance perspective, but also from an incident response perspective? And so, those are the conversations we're having with customers. And, as we dug deeper into the problem, what we uncovered is that, security analysts and people who work on the kind of more like operational security side of things were getting pulled more and more into engineering exercises. And it was really because they had a need, which was, I need this information and I need it in the right place and I need it consistently. But when you have like 20, 30, 50 vendors all sending logs in different formats and different mechanisms at different times, the security analysts just naturally need to go and make sure that the data gets to them. And so, what we really do is we just remove the need to be a data expert. We remove the need to understand how logging works. And, that's the point of working with a dedicated, fabric.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk more about it, but I also want to keep that kind of line of questioning around the specific emphasis on cost reduction. Is that one of the kind of key reasons that you decided to tackle this problem? Because there are so many tools that are basically asking for more cybersecurity budget, but then Realm is kind of unique in that you're able to say, ultimately our goal is to reduce the spend that you're actually making on security tools by making your SIEM less expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the two reasons customers come to us, one is to remove vendor lock, which is exactly what you alluded to previously, which was, hey, I'm using XYZ SIEM. The renewal's way too high, but the operational cost to migrate is way too high. So I'm kind of stuck, right? So that's where the lock comes in. So, when you have an organization that's gone through a SIEM migration every 2 or 3 years, you really learn through pain of like the need to find a different strategic level to operate. So yeah, for us, helping an organization migrate from a SIEM, reducing it from months of time to weeks of time is a pretty powerful outcome in ROI. And then the other side of it is when these security vendors, create logs and decide what to log and what to send, it's more from the perspective of give more, because you never know what the customer's going to need. But then when you think about somebody managing a budget and managing like renewals for SIMs, then you really need to be like, hey, like I need to be thoughtful in what I send where, because that's how I get charged. So it's that disconnect between like we're getting everything sent to us, but we really need to make sure we're only storing the minimum required data. And that's where the cost component comes in for us.
Does that create a kind of strange customer relationship where it's almost a one-off purchase sometimes, where if the core value is helping with a migration, or at least that's like the major pain point that this company is trying to resolve, then they use you for the migration and then say, great, talk to you in 4 years when we want to do another migration. I know you guys have other value besides that, but I can imagine that as a very real conversation that you have with customers.
Yeah, I mean, that quite honestly doesn't really come up in the spirit of that. I haven't really seen. I think there's so much dynamic change in what sources, in what logging pieces people are adopting, that it just makes sense to have a vendor manage the ultimate ingestion and sending of data. Because, if you help somebody do a migration in year one, but then throughout the course of year two, they adopt, 2 to 3 to 4, or migrate away from another endpoint vendor or adopt a different firewall vendor, there's opportunities to remove friction and ease onboarding with those. So it's really, there's like the inputs and the outputs, and we can help reduce friction on either side of the inputs or outputs. So it's not just about SIEM migration. But sure. I understand why you might ask that. It makes total sense.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and then thinking about just where do I want to go with this? Thinking about the kind of like core technology of Realm, can you tell me a little bit more about how it actually works? Like, let's say you have a company that's using Splunk today, and they have all these other sources of log data that's feeding Splunk. So they have their like endpoint logs, they have their EDR systems, they have other like network traffic. How does Realm actually fit in to unify these different sources together?
Yeah. So I'd say you could put it into two categories. There's externally available logging, which would be like an API or another cloud-based solution that can stream logs to you. And then there are a classification of logs which live on-prem. So think like Microsoft or, often firewall logs are all consolidated at an on-prem location. So, there's the ability to have pre-built integrations with the cloud-based vendors. So versus somebody needing to come in and within their SIEM define not only like how from a secure communication perspective you ingest the logs, but also from what is the format of the log and like what language is the log speaking relative to what language needs to be consumed. So we remove all the friction in that, right? So we have pre-built parsers and pre-built ingestion mechanisms for the majority of the big vendors in this space. And then from an on-prem perspective, you actually need to have some software that gives you the ability to ingest not only like the horsepower to, put it in one central location and then send it to our back end from a cloud perspective, but also the same parsing and communication conversion as far as formats of the log data.
Help me understand one layer further. As I'm thinking about the current state, let's say a company has a bunch of Splunk forwarders deployed. So they're already parsing endpoint logs into the proper format that Splunk needs to go ahead and ingest. Obviously, in that scenario, you have it all parsed specifically for Splunk's format, as opposed to, I guess, having a more universal format that you can then reparse specifically for Splunk. Is that basically the differentiation where you're kind of like a middleman that says, hey, we're going to parse this and do a like human readable and machine readable generally format, and then we will reparse it into Splunk if that's what you're using today, or if you're using Datadog, we'll reparse it into Datadog, as opposed to having just the integration built for that specific SIEM, which then causes the lock-in when you try to move. Am I thinking about that the right way?
Yeah, I mean, so like, by definition, if you have the heavy forwarders deployed from Splunk, for example, if you go to migrate to another SIEM, but you need to maintain that Splunk infrastructure, you really haven't migrated from Splunk at all. You're just, you're using their collection points and setting it to a different destination. And, that for some customers might be fine for now, right? Like the heavy forwarders are free. You can download them and use them. But I think there is a appetite to be completely agnostic from a SIEM perspective and move away from having any infrastructure related to the destination. So, we do provide customers the ability to leverage their existing deployment of heavy forwarders or collectors, and we can just pick up the data without them needing to redeploy or configure anything. But we also want to help customers, have an entire, line of demarcation between their SIEM and then what they use for the collection.
Yeah, makes sense. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the kind of approach in terms of how you go and find new customers. I met this company a couple of years ago now that had found like some list of Splunk's biggest customers, and then basically started calling up each one of them and saying, hey, we have a way more cost-effective solution than what you're using today. I was like, wow, Splunk is going to absolutely hate these guys. And what has your approach been in terms of, just reaching out to new individuals again when so many CISOs are just bombarded with calls and emails and LinkedIn connection requests?
Yeah, totally. So I'd say like the conversation of like, let me explain how I can save you money, is a very different kind of like reason to reach out than, hey, I have a somewhat better mousetrap. Like I think especially in this economic climate where organizations are looking to have healthy spend rates and manage, reoccurring costs. So, I think just by definition, I've enjoyed the fact that I can talk to people and be like, hey, I'm trying to save you money. But I think there's other like indicators of our ability to be helpful. So I think, there are some SIEM vendors who don't charge based on ingest, and they don't charge based on the amount of volume of data you're consuming, right? So, as we're starting out and initially coming to market, we're going to focus on the folks who have that problem of ingest costs. And so I think that's a piece of it. I think the thing too that I like about the early stages is it's not necessarily finding people to talk to about your problem. It's finding people who want that problem solved. And so, it's security is a small world. So having been working in this market for 15 years, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of people and just being candid, being like, hey, look, it probably sounds interesting, but like, do you actually want to spend time doing this? And like, if the answer is no, that's great. Like, I'd rather know that now, and let's keep in touch, and I'll stay persistent to a healthy point. But it's really finding people who have the technologies that we can work with that actually want the problem solved, versus like trying to change their perspective, right? Because that's you only have so much time, so you want to try and find the people who want the problem solved. So that probably sounds like a really simple answer to your question, but it's a lot harder in practice when you go out and do it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thread, though, over the course of this entire conversation is staying very focused on individuals and organizations that truly feel the specific problem that you're trying to tackle, not trying to change people's mind and make them aware of a product that maybe they aren't prioritizing today, but say, hey, is this a problem, first of all? Then once you validate that in the market as a whole, the problem exists, finding individuals who really feel that problem and can relate to it, and recognizing that that's the market that you're going after, and saying, hey, we're not going to like waste a bunch of extra cycles on the folks who don't really feel this today. That's not the group that we're going after. Even if the organization maybe like legitimately has the problem, if the buyer doesn't see it or doesn't want to prioritize it, then so be it. I think that's an interesting lens and kind of insight in itself.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's um, sales is very often misunderstood, and I think, how do I frame this? Um, Telling somebody you can't help them is probably just as powerful as telling you that you can help them, because you're saving them time, you're saving you time, and people will honestly want to keep working with you and talking to you in the future if they know that you're going to tell them you can't be helpful to them. So it's yeah, it's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah. So one other thing that occurred to me as we think about the kind of product and the use case that you're addressing is AI, where I imagine LLMs are actually fairly good at this kind of format conversion from one syntax into another, right? So you have a kind of existing format that you need to parse into something else, which you then need to parse into something else. As long as you have the kind of format guidelines for what each of those look like, I imagine something like a Llama is able to do that fairly well and say, okay, yeah, I can go ahead and understand the text from this first example and then parse it into the next thing that you need, as long as you can give me the templates for each of them. Is that actually the case? And how has that maybe impacted like product strategy or like competition thoughts for you?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, like LLMs are only as powerful as the data you can give to train them. And so one of the benefits of this space is all of the log formats and the different syntax from the vendors is very well documented and publicly available. So being able to train these large language models to understand, one syntax and convert it into another is a perfect application of it. There's also a big kind of machine learning component, which, like machine learning has been in security for, over a decade. So it's not really like anything very new, but even just being able to use machine learning on a customer by customer basis to understand what the trends are within their data. Because a lot of times it's, once you get the data into the fabric, that's great. But how do you know when you've deviated from expected behavior? How do you know when maybe a configuration of a firewall is going to cause a 50% increase in your firewall traffic, right? And so being able to leverage machine learning to understand the patterns within customers' kind of data footprint is also a really, I'm not going to say easy application, because I'm quite honestly not the one that has to build it, and it's very hard, but it is a well worth application of like technology towards solving the problem.
I'm sure your engineering team will appreciate the the withholding of the easy comment there.
Yeah, well, they would tell you like 20% of their time it turns into like let's story time for Pete to like explain to Pete how these complex situations arise. So
sure.
We've got a great team. We're very patient with my lack of engineering expertise.
Awesome, Pete. Well, I really appreciate the time. I think this is a great conversation in terms of just some of the good reminders as you think about selling into any organization or selling any product, focusing on the problem, whether that's cybersecurity or any other industry as well. I think there's oftentimes a lot of conversation around how cybersecurity sales is very unique compared to a lot of other industries, and how relationship driven it is, how inundated these CISOs are, but some good just general reminders there. And I think a very unique approach and kind of problem, again, in terms of the cost reduction elements of Realm compared to some of the other cyber tools that exist on the market today. So really interesting to hear your perspective and how it's all been coming together. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, super grateful for the time, and thanks for the thoughtful questions.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.